When I was at junior school in the 1960s, every morning I had to sing hymns. Had to. And sometimes to ease the boredom I might go blah, 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 blah. But then the teacher at the side of the room would somehow know and come stomping down my line and go, "Sing!" So you'd have to join in. Oh Lord God who made everything, we're just crap compared to you. I don't know how you put up with us, we're not even grateful we deserve a good hiding. The man who made it possible for us to sing these hymns but not believe a word of them was Charles Darwin. Yet what most of us are taught about Darwin comes down to one phrase: survival of the fittest, the philosophy of the Conservative Party. Which is why these people argue that it's natural that the country should be run by the strongest, fittest and most powerful specimens. In this programme, I'll be arguing that what these people mean by survival of the fittest is the very opposite of what Darwin believed. As well as those who misinterpret him, there are huge numbers of people who vehemently oppose Darwin's ideas altogether. In 1997, an opinion poll found that 44% of Americans believed that God created man within the last 10,000 years or so. And in 2002, Tony Blair gave his backing to a creationist school in Gateshead. Well, that place is especially worrying because they're Geordie creationists, liable to grab any supporters of Darwin and go, "Are you calling me a chimpanzee, you soft evolutionist ponce?" But in 1809, when Darwin was born, belief in the account of creation given in the book of Genesis was almost universal. The most literal creationists believe that two great events shaped the earth: the creation itself and then the flood, when, according to chapter 6 of Genesis,
the Lord saw how great man's wickedness on earth had become. So the Lord said, I will wipe mankind, whom I have created, from the face of the earth, men and animals and creatures that move along the ground and the birds of the air, for I am grieved that I have made them.
Which was a bit rough on the other animals, wasn't it? They must have been thinking, why take it out on us, you vicious sod? We can't help it if man's wicked, we're starfish. So most people at the time believed that the Earth was only a few thousand years old. A Vice-Chancellor of Cambridge University made a pronouncement that
man was created by the Trinity on October the 23rd, 4004 BC at 9 o'clock in the morning.
I suppose that's so when God finished he could go, just in time for Kilroy. There was a social reason for believing in the creation story. In feudal society, it fitted the picture of a universe in which everything and everyone had their God-given place. Most importantly in this picture, nothing ever changed. In 1744, the German biologist Albrecht von Haller claimed that all generations of mankind were unfolding one by one like a Russian doll, having originally been contained in Eve's ovaries. What must that have looked like in the 16-week scan?
Hier ist der Magen.
Ich weiß doch noch vom letzten Mal, dass ich nüchtern herkommen muss.
Dann sammelt sich hier Blut. Das ist ein Blutkoagel. Die anderen Organe sind soweit unauffällig. Ja.
Beim maledeiten Schlauch schon schlucken müssen.
By the 19th century, with rapid changes in travel and technology and science, belief in the Bible's version of creation was being undermined. And this was accelerated by the discovery of fossils of animals that no longer existed. So some people suggested that God may have staged more than one creation, occasionally making a few creatures extinct. This theory of a series of creations became the orthodox view in scientific circles in the 1800s, particularly with a Dr. McCulloch, who argued that if you studied the fossils of extinct animals closely, you could see that their noses are elevated as a result of them trying to keep breathing during the flood. And I bet some people went, oh yeah, look at that. I reckon you could say, and with these ones, you can see from the position of the front legs that they were trying to attract the attention of the Coast Guard, and some people would believe it. The most influential radical in natural history at this time was Jean-Baptiste Lamarck. He'd written about evolution before Darwin had even been born. In Lamarck's theory, creatures could change themselves through their own habits. So, for example, a giraffe, by stretching to reach tall trees for food, could lengthen its own neck. This would then transfer to its genes so that it would pass on the slightly longer neck to its offspring. Then, after several generations, giraffes would have the length of neck they needed. In other words, he imagined the first long-necked giraffe saying to the other ones, "Hard graft, mate, that's how I got this." Eh? Getting up at 5:30 every morning, doing 2 hours neck stretching before a 10-hour shift at a banana tree. If Lamarck and his disciples were right, it meant that creatures could change without God's intervention, which might be why the old Etonian keeper of shells at the British Museum said,
Lamarck and his disciples vomit abominable trash, almost blasphemous and encouraging imbecility.
Charles Robert Darwin was born in 1809 on the same day as Abraham Lincoln in the house that is now the Valuation Office in Shrewsbury. He was brought up in a wealthy medical family, was privately educated and then went on to Edinburgh to study medicine, but he hated his studies and ended up leaving without a degree.
A professor got Darwin a job on the 5-year voyage of the HMS Beagle, but it's a myth that Darwin's role on the ship was to be the naturalist. The captain, Robert Fitzroy, employed Darwin because he wanted somebody to talk to on the 5-year voyage, and etiquette in the Navy demanded that the captain should never converse with the crew as they were too lower class.
Maybe the Navy was worried that being lower class was contagious and could be caught by naval officers.
Fitzroy also had a second reason for wanting a companion. He was paranoid that he might end up committing suicide. The previous captain of the Beagle had gone mad and shot himself, and Fitzroy's uncle had been Castlereagh, the Tory Foreign Secretary who'd also gone mad and slit his own throat. And now Fitzroy believed that he might have inherited his uncle's suicide gene.
So with a 5-year voyage to negotiate, Fitzroy invited Darwin onto the Beagle as someone of a sufficient social standing that he could talk to. To start with, Darwin and Fitzroy got on fine, and Darwin eventually took over from the ship's previous naturalist, McCormick, who got the hump and went home. After a while, though, tension grew between the two as they began to talk about politics. At one point, Darwin said to Fitzroy,
One of you Tories should be put in pickle as a specimen. As soon you will be as rare as the rarest fungi.
and in evolutionary terms, 160 years does count as quite soon. One night, Darwin and Fitzroy had a row about slavery, Fitzroy being in favour, whereas Darwin wrote,
It makes one's blood boil and heart tremble to think that we Englishmen have been and are so guilty.
After that, they ate in separate quarters.
20 years later, Fitzroy learnt that Darwin had worked out his theories on evolution from discoveries he'd made while on the Beagle. Fitzroy was racked with guilt at his own role. If he'd never employed Darwin, the world might have been spared the abomination of evolution.
He ended up running around waving a Bible, shouting, "This is the truth! This is the truth!" And in the end, the guilt drove him so mad that he slit his own throat.
On the voyage of the Beagle, Darwin collected thousands of specimens and bones and fossils, but it was the Galapagos Islands in the Pacific Ocean that made the greatest impression on him.
While there, he noticed that on each of the many islands, the giant tortoises were different.
The other thing he discovered about the tortoises there was they carried a lot of water in their bladder, which enabled them to crawl about for long periods in the dry interior of the island. So one day, the locals demonstrated to Darwin how, if they were thirsty, they would cut open the tortoise and drink the urine, which Darwin described as having
Only a slightly bitter taste.
Eventually, he studied the dozens of samples of finches that he'd collected from the Galapagos Islands. Like the tortoises, each species was slightly different depending on which island it had come from. If God had created every species, why would he bother to create a different one for every island? And he wondered about the creatures he'd collected with a net from deep in the sea near Tenerife, and wondered why, if God had only created creatures like this as objects of food or beauty for mankind, did he put things where no one was ever going to see them? For God to have spent a vast amount of time and resources making creatures in the middle of the ocean would make no more sense than if someone said, let's spend billions on a giant dome and stick it on some wasteland in Greenwich. At one point, Darwin said,
I cannot persuade myself that a beneficent and omnipotent God would have bothered to design the parasitic wasp with the express intention of its feeding within the living bodies of caterpillars.
And he noticed that sloth fossils he'd collected were entombed with prehistoric animals, and yet sloths still existed. So the sloths were around in both periods, meaning that there can't have been a sudden catastrophe such as a flood that wiped out all the old creatures at the same time. And I bet the later sloths used to go, of course I remember when it was all pterodactyls round here. When Darwin returned to England in 1836, the Whig Party he supported had come to power. Tory Anglicans like the Duke of Wellington looked back to an era of royal patronage and hereditary privilege, but the Whigs wanted Britain run according to the ethics of industry, manufacturing and science. And you don't become world leaders in railways, navigation and engineering if your explanation for earthquakes and fossils is, oh well, God moves in mysterious ways. One journalist wrote,
So much has been altered by the Whigs that they mean not only to change everything on Earth, but to alter the tides and tear down the solar system.
In any species, he said, each individual is slightly different, in the same way that each human is slightly different, but we're still all human. But what happens when there's a change in the environment? Suppose, for example, that a species eats the leaves of trees in an area where the short trees all die out, leaving only the taller ones. Then only the tallest of the species will be able to eat, live and breed. So that after several generations, a whole new species will have evolved, much taller than the model it came from. And this process Darwin called natural selection.
This theory was different from Lamarck's. For Darwin, it was just a matter of pure chance which creatures were more suitable for each environment, and so which ones survived.
Survival of the fittest just meant those individuals that were lucky enough to be best suited to the local conditions. Because if the natural world developed just by protecting the biggest and the strongest, by now every single species would be a massive hulk of muscle. Flamingos would have huge bulging calves.
And the only parrots to survive would be the ones who said, "Do you want a smack in the beak? Do you want a smack in the beak?" As Darwin pieced his theory together, it caused him enormous anxiety. He became obsessive. For example, he used a similar method to the one he'd used to work out natural selection to decide whether or not to get married.
Loves me.
He wrote out 2 columns headed "Marry" and "Not marry."
Loves me not.
Under "Marry" was
Constant companion and friend in old age. Better than a dog, anyhow. Charms of music and female chit-chat. Intolerable to think of spending one's life like a neuter bee.
A biologist's way of saying, well, at least I'd get my end away on a regular basis.
Under "Not marry" was
Conversation of clever men at clubs. Perhaps quarrelling. Not forced to visit relatives.
which may be why he married his cousin. He was thinking, well, think of the time I'm saving in visiting relatives, because her relatives are the same as mine. I'm laughing. While courting his cousin, Emma Wedgwood, he even wrote about his sexual arousal in terms of how it fitted in with his theories.
November the 27th. Sexual desire made my saliva flow. One's tendency to kiss and almost bite that which one sexually loves is probably connected with flow of saliva, hence the action of mouth and jaws.
He wasn't really a romantic, was he? But Darwin's greatest anxiety was his fear of the consequences of his own theories. Here he was with the key to transforming the understanding of the natural world, and it terrified him. So he refused to publish or tell hardly anybody about his findings for 20 years. What was he so scared of? Firstly, that by showing nature changed by chance, he'd confirmed that species form and die out with no plan. Life on Earth could change independently of God's will.
An idea like this in the 1840s could be extremely dangerous because the Chartists were demanding the vote, and in 1842 they called the world's first general strike.
On one demonstration, 150,000 Chartists gathered at Kennington Common to demand the vote.
Britain was on the point of revolution. Several intellectuals blamed the rise in Chartism on the growth in atheism, and it was even claimed that the French Revolution had come about as a result of the decline in religion. So here's the situation that Darwin was faced with. Conservative Anglicans on the one hand and rebellious Chartists on the other. Darwin despised the anti-scientific outlook of the Tories, but he was worried that if he published his theories, he might be promoting the atheism that would in turn encourage further rebellion. So his response to this mood was to retreat further into more obscure research, this time on the sex life of barnacles. He concluded that
The males are the most negative creatures in the world. They have no mouth, no stomach, no thorax, no limbs, no abdomen, and consist wholly of their reproductive organs.
As well as the political implications of natural selection, Darwin was anxious about how it would affect his career. He was one of the country's foremost geologists. Fish and plants had been named after him. He was a shareholder in railway companies. His social life was exchanging witticisms.
owning up to his blasphemous theories would be like Tim Rice getting up at an MCC dinner and saying, "I should inform you that I've taken the decision to join Al-Qaeda."
So for 20 years he carried on writing without ever letting on what he was really thinking. The tiniest incident might make him panic.
And you, Lady Fothergill, would you care to indulge in the delights of one of our esteemed chocolates?
Now, let me see. Jamaican fudge, cherry delight. Marzipan surprise is my natural selection.
You can't have your natural selection. It'll cause too much trouble. How could a banana world be related to an orange supreme? God made the chocolates. No one's saying he didn't. I mean, certainly not me.
Over the years, this made him ill. He developed all manner of anxiety-related symptoms and at times could only get out of bed for a few hours a day.
Yes, Eleanor.
Is it evolution?
Evolution, well said, because... Yeah.
So he was petrified of breaking with his contemporaries, which in some ways is understandable. Historians and scientists have wondered ever since then why this was, but imagine if you were in a pub quiz team and everybody else on your team said, "I know the answer to that one was Bruce Forsyth." Even if you knew that was wrong, would you have the guts to say, "No, it wasn't, it's Bob Monkhouse"? Maybe you would. But what then if the quizmaster said, "And the answer is Bruce Forsyth," and then everyone in the pub said, "Yeah, we got it right, Bruce Forsyth," and then every TV critic in the world came in and said, "Definitely Bruce Forsyth," and then Bob Monkhouse came in and said,
You know, it was Bruce Forsyth.
Would you still have the guts to go, "It wasn't, it was you"?
So one of Darwin's other worries was lack of proof. He knew that every flaw in his argument would be torn to pieces, so he continued building up his evidence. He investigated the possibility of instinct being passed on through natural selection by studying bees. It was true that some bees made mathematically perfect honeycombs, but the Mexican bee used a different system, not quite as perfect. Either this was because the different bees had evolved in different environments, or the Mexican bees were just thicker, in which case there are probably some bees who say, after 20 years of keeping his discoveries to himself, the political situation had calmed down. But two other things happened that provoked Darwin into publishing his theories. In 1851, his favourite daughter, 10-year-old Annie, died of a fever. And this, he said later, chimed the final death knell for his Christianity. But still he stalled, until 1858, when he received a paper from another natural scientist called Alfred Wallace. For some time they'd been sending each other specimens through the post. But now Wallace had written a paper expressing what looked like almost exactly the same ideas as Darwin, and he wanted Darwin's advice on whether to publish them. By now, Darwin had been made so ill by his secret that he was visiting a sanitarium, but even there he started studying the growth rings in the ground's fir trees.
Wallace's letter gave Darwin the impetus he needed. What was the point in protecting the world from his theories if someone else was going to publish the same ideas anyway? So Darwin wrote to Wallace saying that he'd got there first.
After all that, Darwin's publisher, John Murray, didn't think the subject very interesting, and one of his advisers said,
Tell Darwin to concentrate on writing a book about pigeons. Everybody's interested in pigeons.
Then Darwin decided on a title, An Abstract of an Essay on the Origin of Species and Varieties Through Natural Selection. He wouldn't really have made it as a publisher, would he, Darwin? Ah, Miss Bronte, I've got it. A treatise upon the ability of heights to attain their quantum wutheringness.
Eventually called On the Origin of Species, Darwin's book was published in 1859, and he said that revealing his secret was like confessing a murder. The publishers sold all 1,250 copies in the first day.
As Darwin feared, some people did go mad. For example, his friend Huxley was defending natural selection at a lecture in Oxford in 1860 when Bishop Wilberforce stood up and shouted,
Tell me, sire, is it on your grandmother's or grandfather's side that you're descended from a monkey?
One objection was that for natural selection to work would take hundreds of generations to form a new species, and the Earth simply hadn't been around long enough for the evolution of all the world's plants and animals. This was where Darwin shocked the scientific world again with his conclusions of the Earth's age. So when Darwin came up with his figure, it must have been like the Antiques Roadshow.
Do you have any idea how old this item is?
I haven't any idea, because my mother-in-law gave it to me.
Would you be surprised if I told you it was 300 million years old?
Oh, gosh, isn't that marvellous?
But there was one passage in On the Origin of Species that more than any other had the creationists howling with laughter. Whales, Darwin realised, were mammals and so must be related to other mammals. So he wrote,
In North America, the black bear has been seen swimming for hours, catching insects like a whale. I can see no difficulty in a race of bears being rendered by natural selection more aquatic in their structure and habits, till a creature was produced as monstrous as a whale.
Darwin must have felt like when you say something really stupid at school and all the other kids were going, "Yeah, that kid said that a bear could become a whale, you div, ha ha."
Where were the fossils of creatures that were halfway between one species and the next, he was asked? Where was the evidence of this whale-bear thing? Right up into the 1980s, creationists like Alan Haywood in his book Creation and Evolution were saying,
Darwinists rarely mention the whale as it presents them with one of their most insoluble problems.
Until the 1990s, when paleontologists discovered a series of fossils in Pakistan of whales with bear-like features, including Ambulocetus natans, which is Latin for the swimming, walking whale. So it took the evolutionists 130 years, but they got there. It would have been brilliant to ring up the bloke who discovered it and say, guess what? I've discovered a lost page in Darwin that says, I am convinced there is a creature that is half llama and half daddy longlegs.
All credit to the creationists for keeping going, though. The Jehovah's Witness magazine Awake said,
Many of the conclusions by evolutionists are speculative, based mainly as they are on a few old teeth, bones and stones.
And perhaps they have a case that on certain points Darwin wasn't always entirely accurate. Although strangely, they don't seem to apply the same levels of scrutiny to the theory that goes, woman, she was invented out of a man's rib. And your sexual organs, you wouldn't even notice they were there, except that Eve was persuaded to eat an apple by a talking snake.
There was one major omission from On the Origin of Species, which is how humans fitted into this theory of evolution. This, he'd said, would have been too much for people to take in one go, but he sought to redress that in this book, The Descent of Man, written in 1871.
In The Descent of Man, he set out to prove the similarities between humans and apes. He cited the case of a man called Braham, who'd given baboons bowls of strong beer and observed them drunk. He said,
On the following morning, they were cross and dismal. They held their aching heads with both hands and wore a most pitiable expression.
I'll have a large banana with extra chilli.
In The Descent of Man, Darwin showed how closely embryos of animals resemble human embryos, and how the hair on human arms converges towards the elbow, just as it does on gorillas and on chimpanzees. So at one point he wrote,
We do not know whether man is descended from the chimpanzee or gorilla.
Which, in 1871, must have been like a teenage girl saying to her dad, I don't know whether to go out with a Hell's Angel or Gary Glitter. But for the rest of his life, Darwin agonised about the consequences of his science. He refused to publicly support atheists that were tried for blasphemy. And instead of defending himself and his supporters when they were attacked, he buried himself in more research. He carried out an exhaustive study of worms.
He counted the number of worms in his garden, deciding there were 53,767 per acre.
And when he ran out of space to study them, he filled his billiard room with worms.
Nasty kick off the worm there.
He flashed lights at them, blew whistles at them, blew tobacco smoke at them, and got his son to play a bassoon at them.
Towards the end of his life, a layer of scientists emerged who sought to misuse Darwin to try and prove that survival of the fittest meant some humans were born inferior.
This group included Cesare Lombroso, who argued that people who inherited the urge to be criminals also inherited the urge to get tattoos.
Then there was Francis Galton, another of Darwin's cousins and a prominent scientist, who claimed to have used natural selection to prove something else.
I have compiled a beauty data by classifying the girls I passed in streets as attractive, indifferent or repellent. I found London to rank highest for beauty, Aberdeen lowest.
Galton followed the theories of Etienne Serre, a famous French biologist who argued that black people's navels were higher on their stomachs than those of whites, which proved they were more childlike and less intelligent.
And Gustave Le Bon, admired as the founder of social psychology, wrote in 1879,
In the most intelligent races, as among the Parisians, women's brains are closer in size to those of gorillas than male human brains. An intelligent woman is possible, but is as unlikely as a gorilla with two heads.
Darwin opposed all those who used the term survival of the fittest as justification for the inequalities in human society. Rather than suggest that people at the bottom of society only have themselves to blame, he said,
If the misery of our poor be caused not by the laws of nature, but by our institutions, great is our sin.
In fact, he argued that one of the ways humans had survived was by developing a sense of sympathy for the deprived.
And he even added that, as mankind developed, far from the strongest surviving,
The bravest men willing to go to the front of the battle would perish in larger numbers than other men.
now the Church has finally learnt to adapt to Darwin's theories, so most bishops conclude that the Bible isn't necessarily to be taken literally. Which isn't a bad cop-out. Imagine in a law court if someone's evidence was finally found to be complete rubbish. So they said, well, thing is, Your Honour, when I said I was at the cinema on the night of the murder, I obviously didn't mean that literally. It was just a sort of metaphor.
Darwin's genius was to look at the same world as every other human in history and see something completely different, to the extent that 160 years later, the missing links to his theories are still being found. So perhaps it's time that Darwin was given his rightful place. And if kids do have to sing hymns about God creating everything, at least they should be honest hymns and mean everything, including the parasitic wasp.
If you're in the mood to evolve a bit, give your mind a stretch at the Mark Steele Lectures website at www.open2.net. Why not join the forums? They're my natural selection.